I want to start off and say how excited I am to be back here and at BlueHat. One, it's the only place in the world I know that has talking rain in the can, and you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And the other reason is, back when I was here in 2005 and BlueHat was really spinning up, I really wanted to be invited to BlueHat, but I was never a good enough software hacker, and my specialty was management hacks. So thank you to the BlueHat organizers for lowering the bar and letting people like me come in. And I should really say changing the bar, because when the Jeremiah Grossman talks about budget allocation in his session, our time is now. So let's jump into this. And, instead of the obligatory background slide, I thought I'd share a couple of stories and really bookend this memo. It's the good old trustworthy computing memo. And it starts in '97 with my first job at Microsoft. And of all things, I was an IT security auditor. But this was before Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley, before CYA compliance. It was the Wild West, and our job was just to protect the stock price. I mean, it was partying in the unmanaged domains, compromising CorpNet via direct tap networks, hypothetically, war dialing. Wherever we wanted to go, it was a lot of fun. But it was still a prove it to improve it culture. And one day we got this call from a new business group called TransPoint. They were building electronic bill presentment and payment. So he said, hey, come over and review our security. And we said, yeah, no problem. This was the late 90s, so you can imagine what we found: authentication issues, session management, trusted client output from hidden form fields, permissions of server processes running, hardening Windows NT4 and then NT5 systems. But they did something really unique. They said, hey, don't just tell us what's wrong. Why don't you come over here and fix it? So thanks to the old TransPoint team, they taught me how to ship software. And they also taught me how hard it is to prioritize security features into the dev cycle. And just as in IT, it was the same in the dev group. It was very much a prove it to improve it culture. So before you know it, though, during those bubble years, Microsoft decides to get out of that business, sell TransPoint off to CheckFree, dissolve the group. So I popped my head up and decided to go jump in that bubble to a security startup and be the first PM there. So fast forward 2 years to actually right after this memo was released. I was busy helping to sell off all the assets of our failed security startup. And I also get a call from the Microsoft CSO, and Greg says, hey, Jared, we want you to come build a risk management function for us. And so I said, hey, if I have to go back to work in IT, it's going to be at Microsoft. So I come over. This was, past this memo, and it was a completely different world. I mean, this is at Microsoft IT in the wake of trustworthy computing. There was a very public intrusion at the time. There's some private things going on as well. IT had all the real evidence that they needed, and they were given a ton of cash and resources. They had so much work on their list, they weren't capable to execute it. So they needed a mechanism to say, which areas do we need to focus on first? How much value are we going to get from all this new extraordinary spend? And more importantly, when are we done? So we built up the risk framework, we built the pretty pictures, we polished the concrete through PowerPoint. We really came up with a good answer. And looking back, we were dead wrong. And we were wrong because we came up with the answer. So it doesn't matter what it is. When you define winning for your security team, whether it's, say, avoiding material loss or just being able to demonstrate performance against some standard, or maybe it's, say, just get compliant as cheap and fast as you can. What we did was we took that on ourselves to answer that question. And in my experience, I found the answer is, from a security function, to have that iterative process, to package that information, and have the business leaders define what success means to them. So we're going to dig into that some more. And the first point here is that determining the value of security isn't free. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes some leadership. and commitment. And you have to be ready for it. So the outcome that I want to convey in this presentation is really, one, to inspire, but also to help you organize your evidence to improve business decisions from your management and your leadership. It doesn't matter to me if you accept or you fix or you save or you spend. What matters is that you have the discussion that's backed with evidence. And they put me in the cloud track, but this really applies, in my experience, to small dev teams, to large development groups, to IT, and especially in the new cloud businesses. We have some not only internal control requirements, but conveying that to your customer base. So a couple setup slides here, and then we can get into some meat. So I like this slide because it really highlights why I think security is so much fun. I mean, what other position do we get to maneuver the puzzle pieces in all these completely contradictory drivers? We got to make money. No, we got to do more with less. Keep us out of the headlines. Don't get us hacked. We don't want any lawsuits. Minimize the fines. We got to ship faster. Let's go. And the security team says, no problem. We're smart. We're hardened. We can do all this stuff. The reality is, in every security organization that I've been with, at the start, security starts in a reactive posture. And I completely understand this. I've shipped my share of security bugs in the day. Because in the beginning, you focus on what you can control. And you can control your time and resources to accomplish your business goals. And security kind of fades in the background. And from a security lead perspective, with some situational awareness, you know that this is a ticking time bomb ready to go. So here's this timeline that it's really powerful for me from my experience. And again, every group that I've been with has gone through some similar life cycle to this. So it starts off when security is cheap and easy. You're focused on your objectives. The stock is splitting every 18 months. Life is good. Maybe as you mature as a group, you have some compliance requirements. The FCC is there, or your bank regulators. But security is still kind of in the background. This just means, hey, we have to demonstrate that we're compliant for 2 months out of the year. And then all of a sudden, bam, a motivating event happens. I mean, maybe it's customers canceling enterprise agreements, or perception affecting the install base, or cease and desist order, for banks, all hypothetical, of course. But whatever that is, management now has real, tangible impact data, and they know that we need to invest in security. So what typically happens? Whoosh, you get lots of money. You get time, you get resources, you have this long list of things that you need to do. You work your butt off, you got to try and get it done. And you work hard, maybe bring in external people, and then the next year comes along, maybe the year after that, and you ask, hey, if we want to accomplish all these goals, we need even more resources, we need these people. We got to fix, and patch, and train, and management finally comes back and says, hey, what is the value that we're getting from all this investment? They've already forgotten about the motivating event. When are we going to be done with this? And it's at that moment that's the optimal time where you can leverage some of these techniques that I've used over the years. And it really requires taking a leadership position, having some discipline, and taking a time out to do this work. So the key message here, you don't just have to be at that optimal space, but recognize where you are on that spectrum to decide how much gas you're going to push, to be able to determine the value of security. So now we can start to set up this talk. So you have to be able to define, what is winning. You have to put a stake in the ground. And forgive my visual there. But if you don't define where that finish line is, you don't have a baseline. It's probably not going to be correct, but you need something to compare it against. And we define that finish line within two categories. So the first one is, are we operating at an acceptable level of risk? And we're going to help the business understand what that is, and two aspects. Looking into the future by presenting possible and estimate impact and likelihood scenarios. And we're going to look in the past, looking at incidents and root cause analysis. But that's not complete as far as this classic, what is the return on security? Because the complement to that is, what is our own efficiency as a cost center within the team. How effective is our SDL? How effective are our IT controls? And do we have the visibility to even understand that? And from a team perspective, do we have the resources and are we focused on the right things? So we have to be very transparent and honest with ourselves. And these two messages are going to be used to define what that finish line is. And it really kind of dictates the rest of the talk. So let's get in the first technique. Now this one actually applies to both of those sides, and it's really more of a mindset. For me, I really use this to get past that victim mentality. It's like, oh, I don't get enough respect, I don't have enough people, I don't have enough money. And the concept here is to really embrace the difference between mandatory versus discretionary spend. This is the no room for victims, and for me it was very cathartic. So there is a minimum level that's kind of a no-brainer, and often that's defined by the compliance. This is work that we must do. And it's not much, it's pretty easy to get past the checklist, but that's the minimum level. Don't take it personally if you don't want to spend anything more, because it's a business decision. And hopefully the right data was presented to make that a smart business decision. So if more security is required, then we kind of move up to this, what I call legally defensible security. And this is a term that's really starting to mature. Guys like Ben Tomhave and the Info Security Law Group, there's now some cases running through the court systems to define precedents. This can be very powerful. And the way I describe it, imagine you sitting on the courtroom stand, being grilled by an expert witness, and then there's 12 citizens off to the side, and they get to decide, did this person really do what was reasonable in their organization to protect the customer, the PII, the intellectual property? And it's a powerful statement. You think, honestly, you have to ask yourself, how would you answer those questions in the courtroom? So that's what I call the legally defensible security bar. That third level of, again, discretionary, if the business wants it, this is the fun stuff. This is work that we could do if the business wants us to. And this is where SDL really shines, getting security up in the requirement stage. From an IT perspective, getting in front of business decisions. So should we go to the cloud? Where should we outsource? What kind of risk does it present? What about consumerizations? How do employees connect remotely? What about this new billing provider? Whatever the business needs, this is engaging the security team and having them that have the right level of resources in the process so they don't get overlooked and the business decisions are improved. So the simple technique, I really encourage anybody who has visibility to the budgets or your resource requirements, kind of off to the side, spin up a new spreadsheet and segregate your budget with this mechanism. So there's a lot on the slide, and that's part of the message that I want to communicate. As I mentioned earlier, I can't tell you what the value of security is, but I can just share my opinion and my experience on how to determine it. And in my view, it comes across these techniques. On the left there, are we executing an acceptable risk? So what we're going to walk through, obviously, is being able to prioritize what you care about, identify the risks to those assets, what should we do with those risks, and if we do nothing, who should be the right person to accept that, and also get some visibility into how effective is our SDL program or our IT controls. And then on the complement, which a lot of people hesitate to do, is look in the mirror. How efficient are we being? Can we really define what is 100% of what we do? Can we align our capacity and demand to reflect that? And just as we pick on other teams to see how effective they are, we have to look internally from a metric standpoint, and then decide what our core competencies are and what it would take to outsource to be successful. So the first step, this isn't real glamorous work, and I don't think it needs a lot of slides. But you have to be able to prioritize your assets, not just from a threat modeling perspective, but to drive where you're going to spend most of your control and time and efforts. So from an SDL perspective, it's pretty obvious to drive threat modeling. From an IT perspective, oftentimes you really have to prioritize those resources. So from an IT perspective, my favorite hack here is to leverage the business continuity management process. They already have identified where the money is, what key processes and resources are needed to keep the business going. regardless if you're in a cost center or profit center. From an SDL perspective, my favorite technique, and even when I was a product manager, go take the product manager out for a pint. In a social, informal setting, you can really start to understand what they're afraid of and how they think that might happen. And that's excellent information to use when we get into the risk prioritization phase. So just let them know that it may be used against them. So I'm going to spend some more time on this because I think this is a lot of fun. So once we've figured out what's important to the business unit, how do we go about prioritizing risk to those? And we'll talk more about the individual frameworks that we could use, but there's first some common truths. And here, we're not talking about a checklist approach. We're talking about a threat-based. So, this is really, it's the same from the SDL. It is the IT perspective. As you identify the assets and data flows, and you walk through Stride, and you do your threat modeling. This is the same exercise. The key here that's sometimes overlooked is to construct that top-down narrative. The narrative that contains actionable exploitability and evidence, but in context, so the business side and the PDM side can understand and decide to take action or not. So when you're talking about that impact side, to make sure you're engaging not with the technical side, but getting out into the business and calibrating their conversations of what are they afraid of, from a monetary perspective, from a secondary impact perspective, such as reputation and whatnot. And on the likelihood side, that's still a prove it to improve a world. And I'll talk more about that in a few slides. But you have to be able to articulate the exploitability and all those other factors, walking down that CVS-like structure to understand vulnerability attributes, and translate that when you put it on this type of heat map. So speaking of heat map, this is actually one that I think is the most effective, but I don't have a lot of different religion on how to prioritize risks. And there's a lot of warts on this sucker. So let's look at this heat map. It's great because your eyes zoom to the right. Whoa, these things are red. That must be bad. So you better have a good narrative and solid evidence to understand why one risk is more important than the other. You better be able to articulate, what's the impact of a 9 versus a 6 from a likelihood standpoint, or if you're talking about frequency within a time frame. Why does something look like it's going to happen within a year, or it's not going to happen within a year, or we need to invest more to understand? And really, those are really the only three attributes. We can look at percentages or places and colors, but when you need to make a decision, it's not that complex. You have to use your experience and the evidence, from the players on your team. So here's one model, but I wanted to share a couple others. So the one on the right there with the gradient, this is an approach just to use error bars. So as you go out, as you're conducting these assessments, when it comes to the impact side, that's not the dev team's domain. That's not IT's domain. That's the asset owner's domain. So you present those threat scenarios, based on those threat agents. If this happens, what is this going to mean to you in our business? So as you calibrate those conversations, here's the technique to present in an error bar form. Oh, hey, what is the expected best and worst case scenario given these? And again, let them know that their words may be used against them in a bug or prioritization meeting. The third model here, this is using probability distributions to really show our level of confidence in these estimates. And if you have an organization that just has to see these risks quantified in a probability distribution, by all means do it. If you're in a culture that is going to just completely nosedive, and you're going to sit there and argue between 68,000 versus 36,000, like some of my teams in the past, this may be counterproductive. And even if you see in that, if you decide to quantify those impact ranges and the confidence, based off the slopes of your normal distribution probability curve, it comes back to your subjective evidence and that negative or that narrative that you constructed. So the visual is important to communicate the overall message, But it doesn't matter which model you use. It all comes back to, prove it to improve it. So just some more words on actually the evidence, because this is really what makes or breaks a good risk assessment. I don't care if you use the bug bar or dreaded dread. OWASP has a bug prioritization model. There's frameworks coming out all the time. All that gobbledygook behind, that is the detailed threat model that we use. The goal there is to be able to recognize how much information do we need to organize to make the best decision. Sometimes you just need impact and likelihood statement. Other times you really have to break impact and likelihood into its discrete components to get a consistent assessment. It really depends on your culture and the size of your dev team. And I'm happy to take questions on these at the end of the session. I left some room. So here's a really cool concept. I got this from Doug Hubbard's How to Measure Anything. If you're into the stuff that I'm talking about, I highly recommend this book. It's a wonderful read. It beats the crap out of qualitative models too, and they're all really good points. And it also really highlights the ways to make them more effective. So the concept here is pretty simple. It's to recognize the value of the asset that you're assessing. And if this asset is so valuable, the logic says you should be willing to invest in understanding what are the risks to this asset, and what is the evidence we need to have solid information to make this prediction. So, in theory, you should be willing to spend up to the value of that asset, to have that perfect level of risk information. So reality is, we don't have that luxury, but this is a tool to say, look, we're not going to push this bug under the carpet, or we're not going to invest in SDL or this other type of control because we don't have time. If this asset is worth it, we're going to spin up the A&P team, and we're going to find out what's really going on. We're going to do some more intelligence work and find out what threat agents really care about us. The models inside just kind of reflect the typical accuracy associated with. So, when you've got the older dread-style qualitative models, they can be effective in some contexts, but recognize the limitations. My favorite, the evidence-based qualitative, kind of the heat map you saw, backed with evidence. And then for organizations that need to see the dollar values, by all means, spend the extra time and the arguments and use the quantitative approach. So here's something I just threw together the other day, and it really warms my heart. Probably about a year ago, there's been so much great attention. Maybe it's the Aurora attacks, or maybe it's anonymous, but a good emphasis on recognizing the threat agents. And we're finally starting to see the threat models really have multiple risks, maybe with a similar threat scenario, but with different threat agents. So I just put this little construct up here. On the vertical, we've got the agent and some of their motivation, and on the right, some of our investment. There's been tons of great work in this concept. Josh Corman kind of has the seminal and initial work on the chaotic actors and the matrix around that, if you haven't seen it. And it's a pretty obvious theme here, but a couple points I wanted to make. Depending on your product, if the real threat agent is at the hacktivist level, the bar isn't very high. There's this concept of what Josh Corman calls the H.D. Moore's law, as far as the casual hacker is going to be good as the latest Metasploit. So recognize that level of intrusion for the SDL program. As you get up into something interesting where criminals care about you, that's when we have to have a legitimate SDL that we can measure, and we have to be able to identify what's normal and what's not normal. So for folks that actually have intellectual property, as we've seen when we look at advanced adversaries and state-run folks, it's actually been around a lot longer than a year, that's for sure. For sure during my tenure. A great trend that I'm seeing is investment into full packet capture analysis. Really cool. I had the privilege to see a couple of deployments live this year. And not only is it great to be able to index and catalog the full PCAP, but there's a great community behind them to share different query strings about what we need to filter out, looking for anomalies, file extensions, payloads, attributes to identify remote access tools calling out. I think this is it's going to be continue to invest in. I'm really excited for it. So this is one of my favorites, and I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I bet hardly anybody does this. So this is my old friend, the RACI table. Who's accountable, responsible, who contributes, who's informed. There can be only one accountable. And this example RACI here, I don't want to get into the specific details because it will be exactly wrong for you. But the objective here is to identify the players in your decision process, the workflow. And in this case, it's how do we prioritize risk and decide what to do about it. And then you have the discrete actionable steps on the vertical. And when I was a program manager, I would have been laughed out of the building if I wrote this down and showed it to somebody. So I did it implicitly. So if there are any program managers out there or in similar roles, that's my warning to you. So I did this implicitly, really through pecking order and eye contact. So you're in the bug prioritization meeting and you're talking about the exploitability. So you go over to the hacker dev or the dev manager and you're talking about the exploitability. Debate happens and then you ask their opinion, you make the eye contact and you make the note of it. When you're talking about the regression risk and the opportunity cost from a test standpoint, you're on your security testers or your test managers. When you talk about, why do we give a crap about this vulnerability, you're looking over the product manager. And heaven help me if I ever disagreed with any of those and had to escalate. So it's a fabulous tool. If you haven't used these, please just give it a try. It's so much easier to figure this out before the firefight, and trust me on that. So one common objection I hear is, we just don't have enough evidence, we don't have enough time to find it. And in my experience, more often than not, you do have the evidence. And this is the little thing that, it's a little tool I like called the pyramid of evidence. And it's just a method to have a programmatic way of where should we look. So compliance requirements, if you're so blessed with being in a business unit like that, that's a no-brainer. Looking in the past where you have actual tangible impacts that people care about, that's a gold mine. I'm surprised how often I'll see that people don't look back over the last 18 months and take advantage of what's gone on in their environment. And similar to that Doug Hubbard message, if you don't have the evidence, spin up the A&P team, bribe them with whatever sugars, caffeine is needed, and start hacking. If that's still, if you don't have time for that, if that doesn't work, we're starting to see a better body of peer-based influence out there. And in my experience, by the time you hit the top of that pyramid, there's hardly any time or budget left for more esoteric risks or more discretionary risks. You can usually get what you need to make a better decision, as you walk up that stack. So if the risk prioritization was my favorite, I was wrong. I think this is my favorite. So we've figured out what we care about and why. So what are we going to do about it? And from an SDL perspective, I think it's easier than from a larger cloud or operational perspective. So we do all this blood, sweat, and tears. We work our butt off. We get all the evidence and build this rock-solid risk narrative. But then, in my experience, rarely is mitigations and investment prioritized on risk alone. So we came up with this concept of business value. So the risk is what it is, but we have to consider our politics, our capabilities. Was the money already spent? We have to do it anyway, or was it committed? These are factors that are going to influence those mitigation decisions, and come back to mandatory versus discretionary. So I'm not going to get all frustrated if the decision I think should be made isn't made, as long as those business decision leaders were informed. I've done my job. Just make sure you document it, because in 10 months you might be coming back and visiting that. So this is just a nice visual to force that horse trading discussion. It's like, nope, you don't want to do this? Well, this is the risk we're going to be accepting. Are you sure you want to do that? And from a security point of view, do I want to escalate this thing? Okay, so let's step away from the risk assessment process and get into something that I think is so powerful and so underused, and that is getting visibility into our performance, looking at our outcomes over time. Some people call it metrics. I call it measure or fail. And there's a couple techniques that not a lot of people do, and they miss out on some great opportunities. I mean, statistics are just trendy, pardon the pun, but a metric has a winner or a loser. And if you're going to take the time to define a metric, please take the time and define a target. You're tracking actuals of something you think is interesting. Have the discussion to figure out, all right, what is the target value of where this should be? And who decides what that target is? Obviously, it's the security function. It's going to be the specific dev group or control owner. Some metrics might actually have a business owner contribute to what we think this number of FSR bugs or post-prod bugs or incidents or 0 days not identified. Whatever that target is, make an assertion so you can track actual against that. The other benefit from doing this is you can see in this rainbow chart, it really simplifies communication. So non-technical stakeholders, they don't need to understand the metric. They just need to understand, are we performing above or below that expected value? I won't ask how many people do this because it'll just depress me. So another another technique with metrics is to incorporate that conversation in the root cause analysis phase. And somebody once told me, you can always pick out the security guy in the RCA because they're the only one who actually enjoys it. And here I'm asking you to take it one step further. So as you're going through that analysis, consider the metric. And it's a little bit blurry here, so I'll walk through it. Was there a metric present through this incident? And should there have been? We don't have to force the issue. Maybe you don't need one. If you think that some visibility would improve this, if this was a leading indicator, take advantage of the fire, strike while the iron is hot, and get one done. And at the risk of saying this further in the presentation, in my experience, just the act of observing something really changes it. Transparency is a very powerful thing. So back to the flow. If there wasn't if there was a metric, was that target appropriate? And hey, sometimes stuff happens, and you take it on the chin, but you have the right data. Nobody gets fired. You just get a little smarter. But if that target wasn't appropriate, you've already had the conversation with the right people and what you thought was right 6 months ago. So you were wrong. Now you understand why, and that is a powerful message to justify further improvements through that bug prioritization or risk process. So that little loop right there is very powerful from an investment and a budget perspective. Everything, all just from a simple RCA process. I love talking rain. So now when we get into metrics, I can hand this out later, and I'd love to go into detail, but I won't have time. But I wanted to share just a handful of metrics that I've been working with a couple of people out in the industry, many of which I've never met face-to-face, so I don't know if they exist or if they're the same person. But we wanted to identify what is the smallest list of metrics that really correlate to reducing incidents. And we don't know what this correlation is because we don't have any history, but you've got to start somewhere to create a baseline. And that baseline really starts in is, well, how many incidents have we had? How do we know if we're going to improve if we don't know where we're at? So it's taking that time, looking back a couple years, and figuring out how many impacts that you've had, how many not just control lapses, but that have actually affected the business. Then we can kind of walk the stack and figure out, all right, which outcomes do we want to measure? Which metrics correlate to outcomes for leading indicators? And on the AppSec side, these are a couple of my favorites. And the goal here is keep the list small, find things that can correlate to incident reduction. So things like the number of final security review bugs. So things that we just caught at the last moment, they're expensive to fix, and we know that it's a heck of a lot cheaper to address those early on. Number of post-prod bugs. These are ones that attackers or researchers haven't found yet, but we found them. And then, of course, you've got your incidents to correlate that. So it's a very good complement. Issues that we found but no one else did, and items that someone else found and we didn't. So the key there is you're defining a trend for each one of these. So was that level appropriate? And if not, that drives the investment decision. So target, incredibly powerful. Number of security regressions. This is a neat sneaky bug or metric because it implies a lot of things. How fast is that QFE or that quick fix engineering process? What does it mean? Do we have the right type of testing? When we need to release something fast, was security considered? So moving to the more mundane world on the device side, and there is, hundreds of metrics that are out there proposed in the industry, and I think we just need one, or at least we need to start off with one. And that is use the trusty old vuln scanners. They're wonderful tools. There's some excellent feature parity across the products. And that's just to understand what is the patch and config vulns. And it's to take that scanner output and just age them. So you've already had the conversation with the whoever's running those controls. Hey, for the highest severity, we think these need to be addressed within 30 days, whatever it is. So from a visibility standpoint, I call it governance if you can stomach it. You just need to understand what is the age of these vulnerabilities. I mean, how crazy is it? There's so much in the Verizon breach report. I trust everyone here has read it. What is one of the top 5 vulns that led to an intrusion? It's default vendor creds on infrastructure devices. I mean, come on, people. Nessus is free. So that's a very powerful metric in my experience. On the access management side, percent of employees terminated within policy. This is another really nice conniving metric because it implies that you have a mechanism to see when that manager decided that this person needs to leave and when their access was actually revoked. And I won't tell you what the duration was between when I last left Microsoft and when my access was revoked, or how I even may know that number may exist. So now the last metric, percent of role access verification. So this is another area where we're really going to leverage that asset list. So how often do we need to see that we had the appropriate access, that those people are still living, that the right duties were assigned? We're just measuring that process occurred or not. We don't really, at this point, we don't care what the result was. So just the fact that we have visibility there, we can rely that whoever does that exercise has integrity. So I got to keep moving. Now, from a network side, here the focus is visibility. And what that is really depends on the organization or the service, the cloud service. Is it being able to identify the interesting events and logs? But for a lot of organizations, we're now moving to full packet capture. From a metric standpoint, what I've seen people do is start on the ingress and egress points, primarily to be able to pick up on malicious traffic coming in and going out. And then as we demonstrate value on that and you identify, holy crap, we're a little dirtier than we thought, you can justify more investments and move those closer to the critical assets. And another reason is just a bit of a pontification that I've seen this to be so effective is that this is one of those controls that stays within IT. It hasn't matured to the point yet where it stays within IT security. It hasn't matured to the point to go out into IT operations and be part of the larger collective. So they own the boxes, they have hands on keyboard, they have root on those devices, they can drive the success directly. So from a vendor standpoint, and especially as a cloud provider and a cloud user or a high user of outsourcing services, these are a couple of my favorites. Number of those vendors assessed for some frequency based off priority. So again, we're not looking at assets just within our own infrastructure, but those out at our partners as well. And a number of overdue findings from those assessments. So there's another tricky one. It implies that you have a process to find those vulns and age them. From an employee standpoint, there's been a lot of really good discussion about social engineering. Really, what are the metrics around social engineering? And I don't have the best answer, but my favorite of the day is duplicate incidents. So yes, someone's going to open up the spam filter and see an attachment, the email with poor English, and they're going to execute it, and crap happens. But how often does that crap happen? And then we start to have some measurement of, hey, maybe we need different technical controls, or maybe we need to hold certain classes of our employees a bit more accountable for their actions. Now, it's not just about awareness or education. After a point, it gets to accountability. That's a different talk, though. On the change management side, shout out to Secure DevOps and Gene Kim and the folks. Wonderful books if you haven't read them. Number of emergency or unplanned changes, percent of changes with a regression. And again, the value here isn't just trending, it's what is the target. So after 6 months, how many regressions do we really think we need based on these changes? That's a powerful conversation. And notice there's a pretty small list. It shouldn't be too onerous, is my hope. My good friend, the Racy, is coming back. When it comes to metric definition, because so few, or too few, I should say, define their metrics, I thought I was worthy of a quick little Racy. So we've got our players here from security lead, whoever's owning that control, or dev group, the business owner if it's applicable. Who's going to define this metric? As far as an accountability standpoint, I still think this requires some dedicated security expertise. Defining that target, for as often as you can, get the business owner to be accountable for that target. Sometimes it may not apply to them, but their participation is going to be key, because performance against that target is going to drive your ask for resources or spending. Reporting that metric from a visibility standpoint, I think that needs to be within the security function. And this little guy, review target, the longer version is review if the target's appropriate. And this is just a little extra card. If you don't agree with that target definition, this gives you kind of the right to escalate and strap on the chin strap. So now, just for the sake of time, let's kind of shift over. So we're not going to just focus on risks and how to measure that, and communicate it, and determine that. We also have to look at our own team. Are we operating as efficient as possible? And this is the workflow that I showed earlier, so I'll jump right into it. So here's another technique that is sometimes not used, and that's to be able to define what is it that you do. Can you draw a box around 100% of the things that you do? And the reason this is valuable, especially from a security perspective, is we get bombarded by all kinds of crap. There's firefighting going on, and there's new project, and there's stuff that it's actually on our performance reviews, if it's still applicable. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So being able to draw that box of what we do, and then be able to identify the types of activity that make up the majority of our time, just at a high level. Is this business as usual, kind of our mandatory activity? Or are we getting bombarded by discretionary and firefights with short and long-term projects? The benefit of this tool is to be able to set expectations. Hey, this is where you think we're spending all of our time. This is where we're actually spending all of our time. And that can be a very powerful conversation. And here's a fun little tool, again, to set expectations and drive investments in the team. And I mean, how often have you looked at, once you define what you do, to see how mature is that process? There's great frameworks out there with the capability maturity models around people, process, technology. The framework's simple enough. What's powerful is the narrative that you place in it. And this is a self-assessment, so you can defend your own measurements. And the goal here is not just to look at actual. It's where do we think we need to be? Probably the largest gaps and the most attention we're seeing right now is in incident response and SDL. So based on what we're seeing, our situational awareness, our risk assessments, here's where we think we need to be in these key processes. So I prefer the spider diagram. It's a great way for a lot of information to visually identify those gaps. And those gaps then and their associated narrative are going to feed back into your risk assessment process. So just as we picked on the dev and the testers, or the IT and ops guys, we've got to get some metrics and team visibility. You occasionally run across some manager that wants to hide everything under the rug, and it's just so not healthy. Transparency really will set you free, and you really got to show those folks or show them the door. And I've got a larger list of metrics, but you really can start small. These are some of my favorites. So percent of role definitions. So when you have a role like an incident response or an SDL, where you're interacting with multiple different groups, it's really important to understand, all right, given that workflow, who is accountable and responsible for making those decisions? Who is going to decide when to turn off this control if they think it's blocking legitimate business traffic? Having that argument before the incident, really key. Trust me on that one. As far as execution, percentage of project performance, very simple. Are we on time, on budget? Somebody might be already tracking this, but I encourage you to track it yourselves. Own this message so you can own what this percentage means. There's good reasons, there's bad reasons. Take control of that information. Don't let somebody else do it for you. Percent of risk assessments. This doesn't have to be business. It could be components, code coverage. This just shows, based off that asset prioritization, what is our expectation that we're going to revisit and go through threat modeling or go through a risk assessment exercise. So this metric gives visibility, to those outside that, hey, we're performing this on a regular basis. If we're missing that target that we set, why is that? Was the target off, or are we being distracted by other things? So this is a great way to recognize that kind of unsung hero process of going through that risk assessment workflow. All right, in versus outsource. Man, I wish I could attribute this quote to somebody. And I think it's good enough. I'll read it. The best way out of a difficulty is through it. I don't know if anybody's ever been through outsourcing, or you're working with customers from a cloud perspective that they're considering to outsource. There's this perception that when you outsource something, the time you let go of root and somebody else takes it, there's this maturation process that things are going to improve as it gets handed over. And in my experience, it never happens. Number one reason for outsourcing is cost, in my experience. No matter what people say. You could say agility or scale or whatnot, but it's usually cost. So my ask of you in this context is, before that outsourcing occurs, or if you are an outsourcer, before you let your customer outsource what they have, do the data flow, get the process, and more importantly, understand what measurements they need to define success. What metrics do we need to see if this process is actually successful? I think I'm so impressed from an outsource provider, a cloud provider, when they say, hey, this is what we need to be successful. This is what we're going to show you. If you're the one doing the outsourcing, that's really the only way to maintain that accountability. Obviously, you can't outsource that. And if you're really on your game, get those into the contract phase. That'll inspire some really good discussions, because what it might do is start to stress that number one reason why you're outsourcing in the first place is cost. Like, well, it's going to cost us a lot of money to do these things. Well, just because we may not have them now doesn't mean we shouldn't in the future. So enough on that. And I want to hopefully leave you on a higher note, maybe a little inspiration. So just to test this out, measure or grade whatever it is that you do. Construct that negative, get the evidence that you need, that you think will be compelling to affect change, take some action. Give it a shot. Make the pitch. And if it doesn't occur, no problem. Just document the reason why and be at peace. So I had this huge long list, but somebody told me I needed to trim it down. So if you like my pontification, visit us on our blog. And at the risk of being a homer, I have a lot of respect for the new school. I'm sure everybody goes to that blog. If not, hopefully after this. And somebody else yesterday had a slide. I forget who it was. And they said, here's my ask of Microsoft. And I went, yeah, damn, that's a pretty good idea. So here's what I threw together last night. Continue and to share. Just share it is. Microsoft really changed the entire industry with publishing the SDL. I've seen seen evidence of this countless times. I'm sure you've seen it as well. So continue. The job is not done yet, especially when it comes to measurement and communicating value. Come on, there's some metrics out there. There's got to be. Let's get those out in the SDL. You don't have to say what they are here, but show what they are, how they're used, and why they're valuable. And especially from an IT ops space. When I was in IT, we had the IT showcase, and the stuff that we communicated, looking back, was it's pretty kindergarten, but it was groundbreaking outside of Microsoft. People really appreciated that. And one thing that I really miss is the Executive Briefing Center. I really think we've made Microsoft a material amount of money by sharing what we did internally. That knowledge transfer is incredibly powerful, and I want to see more of that. And especially now from a cloud perspective. So you've got people, fidgeting. Do I really want to outsource this to Microsoft? What about lock-in? What about intrusions? Take this opportunity and share, hey, these are the processes that relate to your concerns. Hey, maybe even these are the measurements that we're using to get visibility into those. Some of these things happen on NDA, or a lot of these happen under NDA now. My ask is to bring them up slightly and make them public. And also as a challenge, I know some folks in GFS and some of the other cloud areas. If your processes aren't mature enough that you're proud of that you would share, well, there's a message there. Take that and I would ask, use this ability to really change the industry again to change those. So I think that's it.